Number 10. Freshly hatched spiders. Yuck! This is one of the worst ones out there if you're asking me. It comes to us from one of my all-time favorite spooky Marvel stories, which is featured in Edge of Spider-Verse issue number 4, the previous Edge of Spider-Verse, not the newest one to come out. And the story that we're talking about here is that of Patton Parnell. I love Patton Parnell. Patton Parnell is an alternate version of Peter Parker who is basically a psychotic serial killer in the making. Once he is transformed by a radioactive spider bite, he gains more confidence and literally turns into a monster. He gets revenge on his Uncle Ted, who has mistreated him throughout the years, by placing spider eggs inside of him. Yikes! And, well, those eggs hatch. Uncle Ted isn't the only one who seemingly meets his end this way either. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, why not smash that subscribe button? I know there's some of you out there, some of you that aren't subscribed, probably not you folks that are commenting. I know you're probably subscribed, but you over there, yeah, you should subscribe. Number 9. Lights, Camera, Fire. I feel like so many of these are going to come from Punisher comics because honestly, it's one of the darkest characters we have over at Marvel, and he has also had his own Max series, which was basically all about living on the edge when it came to more graphic subject matter. So if you want some of the worst ways, that's where you're gonna go. You're gonna go to Punisher Max. Case in point, in issue number 30 of Punisher Max, when Frank is in the midst of hunting down those who own an operation that treats people as though they were mere objects. It's a thing I can't say on this platform, but I think you know what I'm talking about here. It's that kind of operation where you're treating people like they're not people. One of the worst things a person can do in terms of business, and one of the most powerful motivations in comics for heroes, or rather anti-heroes, to seriously mess up some bad guys, which is exactly what Frank does to the men involved who are stationed in America. And woman. The older man, Tiberiu, Punisher captures and lights up, recording his demise on film as a warning to be delivered to those in Moldova. Number 8. Strung up like a Christmas decoration. This is going to be an interesting one to try and describe here. Whew, I do not envy myself in this moment. This demise also comes from the Punisher Max issue. Same story, but an earlier issue. Here in issue 28 of the series, before he gets to the head of the operation, Frank deals with his son, Christu, attempting to get information from him on his father, Tiberiu, and their associate, Vera. He attempts to get him to talk by seemingly numbing him and using his organs as basically decorations for a tree. I don't know of Christu's fate, but I can't imagine it ended well for him, knowing how Frank usually deals with criminals. In fact, I'm pretty sure everyone has assumed, based on other things that are mentioned, or just in general based on Frank's nature, that Christu does not make it. Number 7. Crushed by tumors. Of course, when it comes to some of the worst ways to go, it doesn't get more gruesome and depressing than ruins. Every time I think I've escaped this alternate reality and my mind is free from it, there's always another list that brings me back to Marvel Ruins. In Marvel Ruins, one of the worst ways I've seen to go is the way of the Hulk. In this reality, superpowers are depicted as being brutally realistic, so when Bruce Banner becomes irradiated, instead of turning into, his giant, muscular, and vibrantly green alter ego, the Hulk, he just develops a bunch of green tumors that become so large that they basically crush him beneath their weight. Number 6. Death off panel, but then also cannibalism? Janet Van Dyne's death in the Ultimate Universe has to be one of the worst. First of all, we don't even show her enough respect to give her a death on panel, as she drowns during the tidal wave in Ultimatum, one of the many poor victims who die off panel despite deserving an on death panel, especially considering Janet at the time was the leader of the Ultimates, so there's also that. But then, she also gets eaten by the Blob for some reason. It's also weird that they decided to make the Blob do this. I mean, the use of people eating people in Ultimates is just weird in general. I know the Blob is a bad guy as well, but he isn't typically known to be like a cannibal anywhere, ever. Feels like some weird and extremely gross sizeism to me. Number 5. Steamrolled. Well, this one did not kill the person who was victim to it. It would kill most other people and is still one of the worst ways I can think of to die that I've seen on display in the Marvel Universe. This death, not really a death, but you know, could be, comes to us from the pages of Punisher issue number 17, part of the Marvel Knights line, written by Garth Ennis. It seems oddly slow and terrible, a properly terrifying way to go. Yep, we're talking about when Punisher has Wolverine steamrolled. This also happens after Wolverine has already suffered a ton of other awful stuff, losing the skin on his face, getting shot point blank below the belt, and having suffered an attempt at removing his legs with a chainsaw. While he obviously lives past being steamrolled thanks to his healing factor, Wolverine has heightened senses, so he would also feel immense pain with every single inch that the steamroller rolls over him. And he actually goes feet first underneath it. Yikes. Number 4. Shatterproof glass. So this is one of those things where the actual story behind it makes it a heck of a lot worse, and also more poetic in some ways. Once again, we're going to Punisher Max, and once again, we're going to the same story that I was talking about earlier with the insidious operation that Punisher attempts to put a stop to, helping to free the women who find themselves basically trapped within it. However, not all the women involved in this operation are actually victims. One of them is actually a crucial part of running the business, and even suggests how to best break the women they are holding and using so they can be more easily used and manipulated, more malleable. When Frank runs into her, he knows her involvement and decides to dole out a pretty awful punishment: death by being tossed repeatedly into shatterproof glass, which eventually does give out, with the woman, Vera, falling to her doom. I think it's the moments in between being tossed against the glass brutally that really make me feel this is one of the worst ways to go. Those pauses in between, I'm like, oh, cause you know what's coming and you have like no control. I don't like that. I don't like it. Number 3. Slowly consumed. Yeesh! This is probably one of the worst ones I've ever seen or read. I mean, all of these are really bad, but this one haunts me. This one haunts me to this day. When I think about it from a psychological perspective, well, I can't really fully do that because it just messes up my mind too much, so I can't really do it, but you get the idea. Basically, during Marvel Zombies, which happens in an alternate reality where most of the heroes and villains succumb to the virus, but not all of them, one of the people that manages to survive for a good long while is actually T'Challa, aka Black Panther. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that he gets out of the story unscathed, although he does not become a zombie for a very long time. At one point, he is lured into a trap and basically kept as a food source by Hank Pym, aka Ant-Man, or rather Giant Man, who prolongs his friend's death in order to keep the meat fresh, so that he might slowly consume him. Don't worry, Black Panther does manage to escape, he doesn't die this way, but not every single piece of him makes it. And there are others in Marvel Zombies like Mary Jane and Aunt May, who actually do die by being consumed by someone they loved and trusted, Spider-Man. So, yeah. Number 2. Stomach problems. Ugh. Okay, time to talk about Old Man Logan and his fight against Old Man Hulk. If you are familiar with the Old Man Logan universe and the stories that exist within it, I think you know where we're headed. For those of you who aren't, get ready and allow me to explain. Basically, in the Old Man Logan universe, the whole world is left in an apocalyptic state after the supervillains finally win and actually defeat the heroes. Success! Wolverine himself was manipulated into turning on his fellow X-Men by Mysterio, and now is only known as Logan. He doesn't like to go by Wolverine anymore, he doesn't like to think of that because it ended terribly. However, despite all of this and everything he has lived through, Logan still manages to find a way to keep moving and even ends up settling down and starting a family. However, he has to pay money to the Hulk gang, who basically have claimed the land that he and his family live on. Logan ventures out to get said money to basically pay his weird Hulk landlords, and actually succeeds in collecting the money, but arrives home too late as the impatient Hulks returned early and actually murdered his kin. Seeking revenge, Logan challenges Pappy Banner, the head of the Hulk gang. Logan seems to lose the fight when Hulk eats him, but later on, Hulk dies of indigestion. That's what happens when you eat Wolverine. Number 1. Magneto. I think simply facing Magneto would be one of the worst ways to go. He is not a man I would ever want to come up against. I've seen him torment people by pulling all the metal out of their blood, pull off Wolverine's adamantium coating from his skeleton through his skin, and torment and kill a woman with a paperclip. And let's not forget that Magneto at his most skilled and powerful can actually just control blood flow in your body and your brain, basically taking control of your mind or just preventing oxygen from getting to your brain, thereby basically basically suffocating you in a really terrible way. He is basically one of the most frightening people that the Marvel Universe has to offer, and being killed by him for whatever offense he deems worthy of death, I imagine, would just be downright terrible, no matter what it was. Magneto isn't usually one known for doling out quick and painless punishments or deaths, so yeah.
Number 10. Trying to save the day and blowing your head off. Not all superhero teams are created equal. A prime example of this is Section 8, who are possibly the worst team on the DC roster. They have members such as Six Pack, who's just an alcoholic who attacks people with a broken beer bottle, Dog Welder, who welds the bodies of dead dogs to his enemies' faces, and perhaps most useless of all, Friendly Fire. Friendly Fire has the ability to shoot powerful energy blasts out of his hands that deal devastating damage. Unfortunately, as his name suggests, he is totally incapable of hitting what he's aiming at, and instead always ends up hitting his teammates. This has led to the deaths of a couple Section 8 members, but the worst death has got to be the one that occurred when the team went up against the mini-angled ones. These strange visitors attacked the team, easily dispatching team members like Jean de Baton Baton and Dog Welder. Friendly Fire realized it was up to him, and he had to come through for his friends. As he put it, "I gotta do it. Just this once. Gotta hit what I'm aiming at. I can't let my buddies down. Must hold the power." He unleashed the full force of his blast and blew his own head off, barely being able to utter the word crap before dying. This is a bad death, but it also may be one of the most embarrassing ones you could possibly have. Number 9. Death by Psychic Squid. In Alan Moore's Watchmen, Earth is on the verge of atomic war, with the doomsday clock ticking ever closer to the end of the world. In an effort to try and bring the world together with a common enemy, the smartest man on the planet, Ozymandias, puts a plan in motion to ensure a ceasefire between the States and the Soviets. He has a massive psychic squid engineered, and then he teleports it into the middle of New York City. It gives off a psychic pulse that causes the horrible deaths of half of the city. In the beginning of issue 12, we see the result of this, and the streets are littered with terrified looking bodies of people whose last moments were filled with nothing but pain and horror, having been declared acceptable losses in Ozymandias' unilaterally enacted plan to try and save the Earth. It's not the kind of end that anyone wants for themselves, and the cynical calculation of their lives being worth losing makes it even worse. In follow-up stories set in the Watchmen universe, which really shouldn't have been made, but whatever, we learn that this false flag alien attack was discovered by the general populace not long after, making all these deaths utterly meaningless. Number 8. Gorilla Grodd. Gorilla Grodd is a Flash villain who, as his name would suggest, is a gorilla. He is the king of a race of super intelligent gorillas who live in Gorilla City, and of course he hates humanity. He is a formidable foe, having telepathic powers that make him extremely dangerous. Beyond that, he's also a 600-pound gorilla. He is an extremely brutal character, and I don't really have much to say about him, other than the fact that I think getting beaten to death by an angry 600-pound gorilla would be a really terrible way to die. Enough said. Number 7. Getting drained by Parasite. Rudy Jones was a relatively normal man until he won a tour of a LexCorp facility. While there, he dropped a donut on the floor and decided to eat it anyway, citing the 5-second rule. Unfortunately, the donut had landed in a bit of toxic waste and it affected Rudy, transforming him into a pink monster called the Parasite. The Parasite is always hungry and will do anything to try and satiate his hunger. When he goes up against Superman, he drains the Man of Steel's powers and grows stronger, but Superman isn't the only person he will go after. When the Parasite feeds on a normal civilian like you or me, he grabs them and drains their life force. This causes his victim to shrivel up and die, leaving nothing behind but a withered corpse. Now, coming across any supervillain would be a horrible experience, but being grabbed by a monster who painfully drains away the remaining life in your body as you watch yourself shrivel up until you finally die is not how I want to go. I want to die in a tragic hammock accident. Number 6. Joker Venom. If you were to live in Gotham City, the last person you would want to cross paths with is the Ace of Knaves, the Clown Prince of Crime, the Harlequin of Hate, the Joker. Joker is a total psycho who has absolutely no reverence for human life, often claiming his victims' lives in terrible and painful ways. He's had some brutal kills that were relatively one-off in method, like skinning a man alive in one book, but he typically saves these kinds of deaths for henchmen that have crossed him. If you are are a normal civilian coming across Joker, your most likely cause of death will be either getting shot or being poisoned with Joker venom. Joker venom is a special chemical that Joker developed which causes the victim to go into uncontrollable spasms of laughter, which will cause asphyxiation. While this is happening, you would experience vivid hallucinations and madness as the muscles in your face contract into a horrible rictus grin, giving you a resemblance to the man who ended your life. Number 5. Getting eaten. There are a lot of horrible ways to die while living in the DC universe. It seems like no matter where you go, whether it be Gotham, Metropolis, or Keystone City, every other day there is some kind of supervillain attack that is going to result in a massive loss of life until the local superhero manages to stop it. One of the surprisingly common things you would have to worry about as a civilian in the DC universe is how many of these supervillains want to eat you. Off the top of my head, there is Yurd the Unknown, who is one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse but also a giant crocodile. He posed as a hero for a time to join the Black Marvel family before betraying the team and eating Black Adam's sidekick. That's right, that annoying kid who is following the Rock around in the Black Adam movie? Yeah, in the comics he gets eaten by a giant crocodile. And then there's King Shark, who is of course a massive humanoid shark who will often eat his prey. Then there's Killer Croc, who is a human who has a skin condition that makes him look like a crocodile, who is also known for eating people. Now, getting eaten by a monster would suck, but if you were eaten by a giant monster who was like a leviathan, then it would be over in like 1 bite. But these guys, although so large that you couldn't hope to fight back, aren't quite large enough to end your suffering in one chomp, and it would likely take a few very painful and very sharp bites before you bit the dust. Number 4. Turning into a Dollatron. Another Gotham rogue you wouldn't want to come across is Laszlo Valentine, otherwise known as Professor Pig. Pig is trying to achieve human perfection by kidnapping people and turning them into mindless and identical minions who he calls Dollatrons. The method of this is by burning a mask onto your face, which you could never remove, and then using surgical tools to put you through so much unimaginable pain that the trauma causes you to forget your identity and be simply a mindless doll who does Professor Pig's bidding. You may be thinking, oh, Andrew, they're not dead. Why are they on this list? Well, they have no trace of their prior identities remaining, and they have no thoughts or feelings of their own. For all intents and purposes, they're dead. And plus, it is not uncommon for Pig to send his Dollatrons to their deaths for the cause. So if you want to be really specific, this entry could be getting turned into a Dollatron who then blows themselves up. Number 3. Getting injected by the Scarecrow. Dr. Jonathan Crane is a Batman villain who has managed to come up with a chemical that causes those who ingest it to experience their greatest fears. When given the toxin in a gaseous form, the victim will have a really bad trip, seeing hallucinations that correspond with their fears. So if the person is scared of snakes, they will see that. However, Scarecrow also has a strain of his toxin which is much more powerful that he doesn't typically use. When the toxin is injected into the victim, they will experience the same unfathomable level of terror, slowly losing their minds until their heart eventually gives out, causing them to scare themselves to death. This is a rough way to go because you are dealing with the horror of being at the mercy of the Scarecrow, as well as the fear of death, and having to deal with your deepest, darkest fear at the same time. Ah, commitment! Number 2. Getting captured by the Black Mask. When thinking about DC villains you wouldn't want to be stuck with, you might think the answer is Joker or Darkseid, but they, although cruel, usually dispatch their victims pretty quickly, all things considered. No, the villain you really have to hope you don't end up at the mercy of is Roman Sionis, aka the Black Mask. He is not above taking someone out with a simple headshot, but God help you if you come across him on a day where he has some time to kill. He is an expert at advanced interrogation techniques, being able to get even the most strong-willed person to talk after subjecting them to extreme pain, such as when he captured Spoiler near the end of the Batman War Games arc. Even if you don't have information he needs, you might end up in a sticky situation with the Mask, as he has a room designed exclusively for his horrible hobby where he practices on random people just for fun. So that would be a pretty bad way to die. Number 1. Prey of the Hunters 3. In Animal Man Volume 2, Animal Man is dealing with his daughter Maxine's new powers and her connection to the Red, force that connects all animal life in the universe. Animal Man has a strange map show up on his body, which will lead them to the Red, and he and his daughter set out to find it. Going after them are the villainous Hunters 3, who are essentially eldritch creatures from another dimension. They hide in plain sight by feeding on people that they come across. They slurp out your insides, leaving nothing but your skin, which they then get inside and walk around in. The disguise doesn't last very long before they look absolutely terrifying, with tentacles and pincers popping out of your now deformed skin. It's a rough way to go, and the knowledge that you are now a host to an evil creature who is desecrating your corpse makes it my pick for the worst way to die in the DC universe.
Number 10. Kingpin's Mutant Prison. Some of the worst fates really do come from Ruins, where it feels like everything is just awful for the sake of being awful, I guess. I mean, this series was made to sort of contrast the Marvels, and it does that admittedly, but it does that without really having anything else to say, it kind of feels like. When it comes to Quicksilver, he's seemingly still alive in this series, but honestly I can't imagine for much longer, which is how he's kind of making my list here. He ends up having his legs and arms removed because he's too fast, likely. However, Kingpin, his jailer, here claims that this is actually done for, and I quote, Quickie's own good. Considering that it looks like it wasn't done very well, and that it looks like Quicksilver may even still be bleeding, possibly bleeding out at this point, I can't imagine he'll last too much longer, and honestly, what a terrible way to go. Honestly, just existing in Ruins I feel like is a pretty terrible way to go, because if you exist in that world, you're probably already dead, or you're like on your way to dying. I mean, even the protagonist, the narrator we follow on this journey, Phil Sheldon is, so yeah, and he's like the protagonist, so, or at least the narrator. I would say he's still the protagonist, he's still kind of the character we follow. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, and if you love when we talk about pretty bleak things, be sure to let us know by clicking that like button. Number 9. Invisible Woman. Marvel Zombies really does have some of the most gruesome deaths, which is why I would never want to go there myself. This one at least was kind of going to a person that deserved it though, although I feel bad about saying that because I really do love this character, so like it's still sad that this happens in this reality. We are talking here about She-Hulk's death. I do love She-Hulk, although in this instance She-Hulk was already zombified and it kinda ate the kids of Susan Storm aka Invisible Woman and Reed Richards aka Mr. Fantastic in this universe, Valeria and Franklin. Weird thing is, you'd think Franklin would have been able to like fend her off with his reality warping powers, which I assumed he would also have in this universe, but hey, maybe on Earth 2149 Franklin didn't have powers, or you know, he was depowered prematurely. Either way, when Susan finds out that She-Hulk as a zombie has used her knowledge of the Baxter Building codes as someone who was once part of the Fantastic Four team to get in and then devour these two, she loses it and uses her power to create a force field and basically pop She-Hulk's head like a grape. It's insane to me how powerful Sue is. I mean, I guess at least it'd be quick, but yeah, Susan Storm's pretty wild. I would not want to be messed with by Susan Storm. Don't make her upset. Number 8. Driven Mad by Power. Another awful way to die, of course, coming to us from Ruins, is the fate of Silver Surfer. Silver Surfer dies as a result of what they believe to be a sort of superhero madness. In essence, it's believed that Silver Surfer missed the feeling of breathing air for some reason, being unable to as he was, you know, traveling in the vacuum of space without, of course, needing to breathe. However, this was the very time when he decided, hey, you know what? I'd love to breathe right now, even though there's no air around me. Not a great time considering, yeah, there's no oxygen there, you're just floating around in the space between stars and planets. However, Silver Surfer is believed to have basically torn himself apart, clawing at himself until his lungs were exposed, and of course, despite having the power cosmic, he died. It's believed he died from the shock of the cold. I mean, honestly, what a way to go. Become so crazed that you think tearing yourself apart so you can breathe while flying alone in outer space on a silver surfboard is a good idea, or is simply something you must do. I can't imagine that. Also, I love how it's like, I gotta breathe, like time to rip myself apart. Okay then. Number 7. Squip Grub Chulp. What does that mean? You're about to find out. Symbiotes are definitely some of the most frightening creatures we have in the Marvel Universe. Definitely would not want to be rescued by one. Sorry, Venom. But also would never want to be dubbed a criminal by one. For years, Venom had been threatening to eat people's brains, and guess what? It also became more than a threat at one point. Venom threatened to do this because the symbiote actually feeds on the happy chemicals that brains produce, so either it needs a host with a good supply of that, or one one that basically snacks on chocolate a lot, which is why Eddie usually does that. Otherwise, it would literally have to find some brains to eat because it needs those chemicals, baby. Now, I'm pretty sure Venom has moved past this requirement in the modern day of comics right now, but it doesn't stop it from being a deeply disturbing thing that the symbiote did/needed to do to survive at one point. Also, for anyone who was wondering, the name of this point is the sounds that Venom made when, you know, scarfing down some brains. So, ugh. Number 6, microwaved. This one makes me very uncomfortable, but I'm gonna tell you about it anyways because that's my job, so that's what I gotta do right now. Even though, of course, it's in a Deadpool story, which I think is the only place you could get away with something like this at Marvel Comics. In the comic Deadpool Kills Deadpool, we head to the multiverse where Deadpool, a version of Deadpool anyways, is hunting down, well, other Deadpools. Like the title says, Deadpool kills Deadpool. That's what's happening here. Right at the beginning of the series in issue number 1, the sinister black-suited Deadpool ends up confronting his alternate zombified self, Headpool, who is of course also known as Deadpool though, but we're gonna call him Headpool for clarity's sake. Headpool hails from the Marvel zombie universe of Earth 2149, where the world was ravaged by zombies. This zombie though ended up making his way to Earth 616 before he was reduced to just being a head. So how does the evil Deadpool deal with him? Pretty easily and terribly by popping him in a microwave. Splat! Number 5. Devoured by spiders. What a way to go. I just love spooky, scary Spider-Man stories, and this one comes from another tale based in the Spider-Man multiverse. We are talking about the fate of Spiders-Man. Spiders-Man is like Spider-Man, but this Peter Parker, instead of becoming a man with spider-like powers, basically became spiders. Peter Parker in this case fell into a vat of experimental spiders who devoured him completely. However, because science, they also ended up taking on his consciousness, which survived his physical death, with the spiders becoming kind of like a new version of that character, the hero Spiders-Man, who is entirely made up of spiders, and who also kind of goes on to become a villain, but that's a story for another time. Now, I personally am not too bothered by spiders in my everyday life, but I also feel like I've never dealt with, you know, a whole vat of hungry spiders who wanted to eat me. So on paper, this one remains pretty terrifying to me, even though I'm usually pretty cool with spiders. Number 4. The Meaty Revenge. On our part 1, we talked about the tragic and disrespectful death of Janet Van Dyne in the Ultimate Universe, aka the Wasp, but at least we can say she was avenged. Or we could say that if this avenging wasn't so terrible. I don't know if we can quite say that because it's pretty terrible what happens here. When Hank Pym, aka Giant Man, aka Ant-Man, finds out that not only is Janet dead, but that the Blob also desecrated her corpse by, you know, well, eating her, he decides to get revenge by doing the same to Blob, but while he is still alive, because Ultimate Universe. Hank grows to his giant size and then picks Blob up and basically bites off his head. Although at least I guess he doesn't eat him, he instead, you know, spits Blob's head out, but still the whole scene is not saved from being insanely awful, I'd say, and this is still not a way that I personally would want to go. Honestly, facing a giant being just seems like a bad way to go in general. I don't like that idea. I don't like things that are gigantic. It makes me uncomfortable. If you're not eaten, you're still likely getting squashed, and that's just a yikes to me. I don't want someone to step on me. That's no thank you. Number 3. Sinking with your best pal. Possibly one of the worst ways I can imagine going just in general. Whether we're talking about comic books or real life, this way is pretty bad. Even just based on the circumstances here, the way that Captain Kate Pryde went is just really sad too. She went down with a ship, drowned, which many have said is actually one of the most painful ways to go. And what made her death even worse was that she believed one of her best friends, her pal Lockheed, also perished with her. This happened when Sebastian Shaw attempted to remove Kate from the Hellfire Trading Company, which she sat on the board of as their Red Queen, by, well, I mean drowning her, killing her. You know. Number 2. Starvation and isolation. This one comes to us from Magneto, who saw this as a fair punishment to dole out to Red Skull, based on his treatment of other humans during World War II when he was obviously allied with Germany in the Third Reich. Magneto in essence took Red Skull to an isolated underground bunker, leaving him trapped there without any way out as the door was locked and located on the roof of the bunker. Red Skull was left with no ladder and only some water to basically keep him company, which he'd have to ration in order to prolong his survival, although obviously I don't think Magneto really intended him to survive. During his time trapped here, he began to hallucinate and started to lose his mind as starvation set in. I think this is possibly one of the worst ways to go in general, so once again, Magneto takes one of our top spots. Basically, don't upset Magneto. Just don't do that. Number 1. Carnage. I'd like to think Fireball Earth for this terrifying and very true suggestion, so thank you from the comments. This is such a good point. Carnage is so frightening. Carnage is definitely one of the worst ways to go in the Marvel Universe. With Carnage, you not only have to deal with having your life ended by a symbiote, which honestly, like I said, is terrifying enough, but you also have to deal with Cletus Kasady, who is the other part of Carnage. Carnage is one entity made up of two: serial killer Cletus Kasady and his soulmate, the alien symbiote offspring of Venom, who we often name Carnage, but technically Carnage is the entity of both of them together. Anyways, this symbiote is actually Venom's first child, who quickly became known as one of the most cruel and deadly out there, largely due to their connection to Cletus. I've seen what Carnage does when he has a whole town full of people to play with in Carnage USA, when the villain took control of an entire town, and it is definitely not pretty. Hands down, it's one of the most frightening Carnage stories I've ever read, so I would not want to be part of that at all. No thank you.
Number 10. Reverse Flash Brain Scramble. Reverse Flash is one of the most brutal villains in the DC universe, with his unhinged psychopathy, prompting him to end people's lives in incredibly disturbing ways, sometimes going back in time to prevent people from ever having even been born, and other times using his incredible speed to turn himself into a lethal weapon. In the Flash TV show, we've seen him vibrate his hand and use it to stop people's hearts, but in the classic comics, he used a similar but slightly different method on the Flash's wife. Over the course of their many battles, the hatred between Reverse Flash and the Flash grew exponentially, but while this was occurring, Reverse Flash was also falling in love with Barry's wife, Iris. He came into their home when Barry was away and proposed to Iris, who said no, because she loved her husband, and also because Reverse Flash is a crazy psycho. Reverse Flash got his revenge by sneaking into a costume party where everyone was dressed as superheroes, and he murdered Iris, who was dressed as Batgirl, by vibrating his hand so that it could pass through her skull and scramble her brain. There are certainly more painful ways to go, but the speed of this death is what makes it so bad. One moment you're at a party with your whole life ahead of you, and the next your brain has been torn apart at super speed and you're just gone. Number 9. Jason Todd's death. Jason Todd has had a pretty rough life. He was an orphan living on the streets before one fateful day he attempted to steal the tires off of the Batmobile in Crime Alley. Batman caught him in the act and decided that the best way to help the boy handle his rage was to give him an outlet, training him to be the second Robin after Dick Grayson left to become Nightwing. Things were looking up. Jason eventually discovered that his birth mother was still alive and set out to find her. He eventually found Dr. Sheila Haywood working in a refugee camp in Iran, but discovered that she was being blackmailed by the Joker into letting him steal important supplies. He offered to help his mother, revealing that he was the Boy Wonder, and she led him to a warehouse. Once there, Jason realized that his mother had led him into a trap as she was embezzling hospital funds, and felt that if Robin was allowed to live, her operation would be at risk. She turned him over to the Joker, who beat him nearly to death with a crowbar, and then left him in the building, which was rigged to explode. So, Jason found his real mother, was almost immediately betrayed by her, beaten up by a homicidal clown, and then blown up. He eventually returned from the dead, but that doesn't change the fact that this was a rough way to go. Number 8. Gentleman Ghost's Unending Torment. Jim Craddock was a highwayman in the 1800s who came to America from England and began being known as Gentleman Jim. He crossed paths with the famous gunslingers Nighthawk and Cinnamon, and although Jim was a criminal, Nighthawk mistakenly believed that he had committed a crime against his wife. As a result, Nighthawk executed Jim in cold blood. Jim came back as a ghost, doomed to wander the earth until he could get his revenge and end the lives of his executioners. Unfortunately for the Gentleman Ghost, his executioners are one of the many reincarnations of Hawkman and Hawkgirl, who are always reborn anew whenever they die. Therefore, there is no way for Gentleman Ghost to fulfill his curse, and he is doomed to never enter the afterlife, having been a ghost for hundreds of years. Now, getting executed for a crime you didn't do is bad enough. Becoming a ghost who can't move on to the next life until he has revenge is worse. But finding out that the people you have to get revenge against are unable to stay dead, therefore making your entire curse unfulfillable, is a whole other level of awful. Number 7. infected by the Carrier. Appearing in the Batman Journey into Night miniseries from 2005, the Carrier is a villain who was infected with a deadly disease while searching for treasure in a cave. He survived, but as a result, he became deadly to anyone who so much as breathed the same air as him. Anyone who came into contact with him would begin going through painful contractions as they struggled to breathe and began forming large infected pustules and foaming green gunk out of their mouths. Carrier eventually discovered that he could prevent this by wearing a gas mask with reversed filters and set upon a quest for revenge against the man who sold him the bogus treasure map. Huge amounts of people died as a result of Carrier coming to Gotham, and the speed at which they were infected, symptomatic, and finally dead was a horrifying way for anyone unfortunate to cross paths with the Carrier to go. Number 6. Death by Rorschach. The characters featured in Alan Moore's Watchmen are extremely brutal with their enemies, with one of the most aggressive of the vigilantes being Walter Kovacs, aka Rorschach. Rorschach is known for ending the lives of his enemies in increasingly brutal ways. In the book, we are told one enemy got dropped down an elevator shaft. In a flashback, we see him handcuff a man in a burning house, giving him a hacksaw so he would spend his last moments trying to remove his own hand. And in Issue 8, Rorschach electrocutes a man and drowns another with a toilet. I think the most painful method that we see the character use in the story is in issue number 6, when he is in prison. One of the other prisoners approaches him in the cafeteria line, tries to use a shiv against the imprisoned vigilante. Rorschach responds by grabbing a tray of boiling oil and throwing it in the prisoner's face. The man is horrifically burned as Rorschach is dragged away, reminding the various prisoners that he isn't locked up with them, they're locked up with him. The burned man spends days in the prison hospital in excruciating pain before he finally passes away from his injuries. Number 5. Abattoir's family drama. Abattoir was a Gotham villain who believed that by ending the lives of his family members, he could absorb their life forces and become immortal. He went about destroying his family tree, but was frequently thwarted by Batman. During the Nightfall arc, where Bruce Wayne was out of commission due to a broken spine, and Jean-Paul Valley was the new Batman, Abattoir went after the last living member of his family, Graham Etchison. He put Graham in an elaborate death trap designed to cause Graham as much pain as possible before his death. He put Graham on a bed of nails with a special rig set up that would drop a weight on him every hour or so. With every new weight, Graham would sink deeper into the nails until he would eventually die after several hours. The new Batman went after Abattoir, but was more concerned with punishing evil than he was with protecting innocent lives, and let the villain fall into a vat of molten steel. As a result, Abattoir was unable to lead Jean-Paul to Graham, and he died a slow and painful death. Number 4. Mr. Hyde plays Hyde the Jekyll with the Invisible Man. Another Alan Moore series known for its dark themes and extreme violence is The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. In it, characters from classic literature come together to form a team. One of the members of the team is Holly Griffin, otherwise known as the Invisible Man. He is a twisted monster of a man who uses his abilities to have his way with unsuspecting women, and in volume 2 of the series, he takes his lack of morality to new levels. When Martians invade the Earth, he realizes that there is no way for humanity to win the War of the Worlds, and decides to save his own skin by making a deal with the invaders to betray humanity in exchange for being allowed to rule the planet alongside them. He also attacks his teammate Mina Murray, thus earning the ire of another of his teammates, Edward Hyde. In the League universe, Edward Hyde is kind of similar to the Hulk, being incredibly strong and about 3 times his usual size. So, in issue 5 of volume 2, he decided to use his size to his advantage, beating and pinning down the Invisible Man. He then spent hours brutally, well, you know, over and over until the Invisible Man died. His remains becoming visible only once he had fully expired after hours of pain and humiliation at Hyde's hands. Number 3. Batman Who Laughs Super Brutal Murder. When the Joker of Earth-22 found out that he was dying, he decided to go on one last spree in an attempt to send Batman over the edge. He took out all of the other supervillains in Gotham, as well as Jim Gordon. He blew up several buildings and captured captured Batman. He forced the Dark Knight to watch as he ended the lives of the parents of kidnapped children in front of them before infecting them with the Joker toxin. In order to stop the madness, Batman broke free and broke the Clown Prince's neck. When he did this, Batman was inadvertently exposed to a Joker toxin, which corrupted his mind and gave him the Joker's sick and twisted sense of humor and murderous desires. This Batman went on to kill the Bat family, as well as the entire Justice League, before using his evil cunning to take over and destroy his world. His methods of taking out his former teammates were all awful, but the most despicable of them has to be how he took out Superman and his family. He brought Superman, his son John, and Lois Lane together, and then exposed Clark and John to black kryptonite. This particular strain of kryptonite drives Kryptonians insane, and as a result, Clark and John ripped Lois apart before attacking each other, as the Batman Who Laughs watched their cruel and messy demise. Number 2. Anything involving the Spectre. The spirit of vengeance in the DC universe first appeared in More Fun Comics number 52. He was originally a demon named Aztar, who was helping Lucifer try and take control of heaven. He eventually had a change of heart and surrendered to the Archangel Michael. As a means of atonement, his memory and consciousness were wiped, and he was transformed into the Spectre. He is divinely powered, being capable of almost anything he can imagine, can travel between dimensions, and can shoot energy blasts. He's immortal and capable of flight, intangibility, possession, telepathy, and telekinesis, just to name a few of his powers. In order to temper this power, he must be bonded to a human host, with this most often being Jim Corrigan. Spectre has no limit to his power, but is bound by the morality of his host, who often prevents him from unleashing the full wrath of God upon his enemies. He is known for subjecting his victims to fates worse than death, before eventually subjecting them to death as well. Over his years in the comics, he has used some strange and disturbing methods to dispatch his enemies, such as aging them to death, melting them, cutting them in half with a giant pair of scissors, turning a man into a sentient and feeling mannequin who is then dumped in a fire and painfully burnt, turning a bunch of junkies into his fingertips and then injecting them with liquid fire, or in one extreme case, burning down an entire country. Number 1. The Omega Sanction. The villain Darkseid is perhaps the most evil being in the DC universe, being a frequent foe of the Justice League. Sure, he might destroy you with his incredible strength, or even with the use of his Omega beams, which are essentially deadly energy beams that always find their target, usually reducing the victim to ash. That's bad, but it could be worse if Darkseid instead used the Omega Sanction. The Omega Sanction traps you in an endless series of lives, each one more painful and awful than the last. So, you don't just die a horrible death, you die horrible death after horrible death without respite forever. It doesn't get much worse than that.
Number 10. Mark of Cain. Of the most gruesome ways to go, I think one of the worst would be to get Mark of Cained. Cain marked? I don't know if that's really how we say that, but sure. We can say it either of those ways for now, because I don't know what else to call that. Kane Parker is a clone of Peter Parker, of the two main clones we know from the Clone Saga. He was the one who was actually more dramatic and broody. He had long hair and for a while was more of an antagonist, or at least believed to be so. Kane was also known for straight up killing people that got in his way, with his Mark of Cain. What is the Mark of Cain? While initially we kind of thought it was like its own ability, it's actually just Peter's like little hook. Kane would basically put his hand on someone's face and then turn on this sticky ability, which resulted in him seemingly burning the face of his victim. I mean, I don't know if this would actually kill you, but I feel like if this was at all involved in the process of Kane killing me, I would not be interested in that at all. Unless I guess I was already dead. Then I guess I'd kind of be fine with it, because I'd be like, well, I'm not here to feel that, so cool. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, why not show us you love us by clicking that subscribe? I know there's a lot of you out there that aren't subscribed, and if you're already subscribed, let me know in the comments.
Number 9. Man-Thing. In 1971, Marvel introduced Man-Thing. He was a scientist named Ted Sallis trying to create his own version of the super soldier serum before being attacked by criminals who wanted to steal his work. To keep the formula secret, Ted injected himself with the serum before getting in a car accident that caused his car to crash into a magic swamp. The serum and the magic caused him to transform into a big green swamp monster who was able to control plant life as well as a host of other abilities. One of his powers is to sense human emotions emotion, with him having different reactions to different feelings. Fear sends Man-Thing into a fit of rage, and when he senses it, his body automatically secretes a corrosive acid-like agent that will burn anyone he touches. Hence the series tagline, "Whatever knows fear burns at the Man-Thing's touch." Now, I don't know about you, but if I came across a creature like Man-Thing, it would be difficult not to be afraid. So I really don't know how well I would do, and the idea of being grabbed by such a beast and burned to death because he's mad that I'm afraid sounds like a rough way to go.
Number 8. Torn to Shreds. This was a hard one to rank because while I feel like it would be really awful, I also still feel like there's somehow worse out there in the Marvel Universe waiting for me. Were I a person? Gosh, that would be terrible. I would hope that I was a superhero. That's the best I can hope, really. Still, this kind of death is pretty much as bad as it gets if we're speaking in general terms than, you know, straight up ranking it as one of the worst ways to die in the Marvel multiverse, which is kind of actually what we are doing here, but still, I digress. It's pretty bad. Deadpool is one of the folks who has undergone this usually life-ending process multiple times. One such time actually happened when he faced off against Carnage, who actually made a pretty dramatic appearance on our part 2 for this series. Of course, Carnage would take this approach to fighting and probably also immensely enjoy it, which it makes it, I think, that much worse. Now, because this is Deadpool, he didn't die here because Deadpool. However, this wasn't even where everything ended for Deadpool because Carnage also was plotting to burn down the building that this happened in. So Deadpool would have in theory been diced and then kind of flambéed.
Number 7. Absorbed by the Hulk. One of the most feared figures in the Marvel Universe for both hero and villain alike is the Incredible Hulk. Despite his reputation as a giant raging green monster, the Hulk goes out of his way to not be responsible for the deaths of any of the civilians or villains that he has to fight while rampaging through the world. Despite this, it does happen from time to time. In the Ultimate Universe, the Hulk is known for eating people, which is of course a terrible way to go, and getting smashed by the Jade Giant would of course be a horrible experience, but I think the worst way that you could meet your end at the hands of the Hulk is the way featured in Immortal Hulk number 8. In this issue, the Hulk has been captured by a secretive Black Ops organization called Shadow Base. In order to prevent the Hulk from escaping, they have vivisected him into multiple pieces which they keep in separate jars, in order to prevent his healing factor from allowing him to come together and escape. The evil Dr. Clive, who is in charge of the program, is running various cruel experiments on the Hulk in order to fully understand the power of his healing factor. Little did Clive know, he was doing exactly what the Hulk wanted him to. He wanted Clive to run the experiment so that he could learn more about himself, and once he knew what he needed, he controlled his hand in one of the jars to snap its fingers, creating a shockwave that shattered the jars, allowing Hulk's various parts to reform and heal. Hulk took Dr. Clive's treatment personally, and as he reformed, he absorbed the Doctor into himself, causing the Doctor to be smothered by the Hulk's innards as he desperately begged for mercy that wasn't coming. It is a fitting end for such a character, but it's not a fate I would want to endure while living in the Marvel Universe.
Number 6. Ripped in half. Being ripped in half really does not seem fun, and yet for some reason this is a very common way to die when it comes to Marvel Comics. I can't count how many times someone has been ripped in half. I literally can't, because every time I attempt to, I actually think of another occurrence of this happening, and then I have to start all over again. So it's very hard for me to put a number on that one. It's terrible. Or, you know, maybe it's just comics. The one thing I'd really warn against, you know, if you're looking out from us at the Marvel Multiverse, is that while living in whatever world you are in, you should basically never do this to another person, be they villain or hero, regardless of your alignment or their alignment. Just don't do it. I've seen this kind of could basically come back to haunt characters who generally also get torn in half by someone else as some kind of like karmic payback, so if you've done it to someone, it's probably coming for you.
Number 5. The U-Men. The mutants of the Marvel Universe have had a pretty rough go of it, being subjected to many atrocities due to the prejudices of the humans that despise them. Usually the humans are convinced that the mutants are dangerous and desire their extermination, so they can take their place as the next step in evolution, which makes the humans try to exterminate them first. Other comics explore how the mutant hate doesn't really make a lot of sense, as the humans will praise the superpowered beings until they find out that they're mutants, at which point they will turn against them. However, some of the humans hate the mutants out of sheer jealousy. For example, the Homo Perfectus movement, which are humans who believe that they are mutants stuck in human bodies and wish to undergo surgery to empower themselves with mutant powers. There was a cult-like faction of the group called the U-Men who swore against ever having contact with the impure world until they had had their powers, and wore containers containment suits until they could be transformed. The way the U-Men went about this was by traveling the country and capturing mutants who they would then harvest organs and body parts from in order to empower their members. Life for mutants is hard enough, but being captured by an insane cult with a military budget who want to dissect you and steal your body parts in a crazy quest to steal your powers is one of the worst, as it is a painful and demeaning way to go, as in the words of their leader, John Sublime, to them, mutants are just livestock.
Number 4. Daken. What's worse than being livestock? Being Daken's livestock, I guess. If Wolverine is the best at what he does, Daken is the one who simply enjoys what he does a little too much. Daken is a trained killer, and we get to see this side of him on full display during his fight against the Punisher during Dark Reign. It was during this era of Marvel that we saw Norman Osborn take over as leader of the Avengers after S.H.I.E.L.D. was no more, and he was basically put in charge of his very own organization, which he named HAMMER, an acronym that stands for, well, nothing really. Osborn just liked the sound of it. During this time, working for Osborn, the Dark Avengers were given a list of targets for them to remove, them to get rid of. One such person on that list was Frank Castle. This death is also what we'd call overkill. Daken not only tears Frank apart and runs him through with his claws multiple times, but in the end, he also removes his head. Of course, Frank wouldn't straight up die, but instead would later return as the undead Frankencastle, but regardless, I still think this would be a terrible way to go.
Number 3. Miss Arrow. When Spider-Man was killed by Morlun in the Others event, his body was put in a cocoon under the Brooklyn Bridge until he returned to life. He shed his skin, and this skin was taken over by a bunch of spiders, who formed a being called Arrow, who was intent on killing Spider-Man once and for all. Arrow began going by Miss Arrow, and she tried to impregnate Flash Thompson with an egg sac that would give birth to thousands of her offspring, but was stopped by a shotgun-wielding Betty Brant. Miss Arrow tried to escape, but Spider-Man pursued her, eventually managing to force her into the Central Park Zoo's aviary. The various exotic birds were thrilled with the group of spiders before them, and went about eating Miss Arrow one spider at a time as she thrashed and screamed. The birds ate almost every spider, leaving only one left, which Spider-Man promptly stepped on.
Number 2. Sabretooth. While Daken and the U-Men are both pretty terrible, if there was one person I wouldn't want to be killed by in the Marvel Universe, it would probably be Sabretooth. Victor Creed is probably one of the most vicious and evil characters we have in the Marvel Universe. Sure, he's done some heroic stuff before, mainly when his alignment was flipped or if we're talking about alternate realities, but this is a man who legitimately revels in violence usually. When he was sent to the pit in Krakoa as punishment, he used this time to kill all the X-Men and heroes he felt had ever slighted him. In his dreams, of course. This wasn't real, but it was still pretty brutal. And when that was done, he decided to create his own hell, and then plot his own escape, even double-crossing the prisoners that he had planned his escape with. Yeah, Creed has to be one of the worst ways to go, hands down.
Number 1. Deadpool's counter to the healing factor. On Earth 12,101, the X-Men grew tired of Deadpool's instability and insanity and had him committed to the Ravencroft Asylum, hoping that he would be cured of his madness. Unfortunately, his doctor was really a disguised psycho man who was using his position to try and brainwash insane people into doing his bidding. He took away the voices in Wade's head, but they were replaced by a new voice that was telling Deadpool to kill everyone. He became aware of his status as a fictional puppet and went on a killing spree of everyone in the Marvel Universe, both hero and villain alike. We get detailed accounts of how he kills the various characters in increasingly brutal and twisted ways, with some highlights being him taking out Thor by growing his hammer with Pym particles so that Thor is crushed underneath it, or trapping the X-Men in an insane death trap. But out of all the fates he subjects the various characters to, I think the worst is what he does to the characters with healing factors. Being a character with a powerful healing factor, Deadpool is uniquely qualified for taking out other such characters, and as Wolverine discovers when he walks into a trap, Deadpool has it all figured out. He has captured Daken and X-23 and left them suspended with a computer-controlled flamethrower. The computer keeps track of their vitals, and every time they come back to life and begin to regenerate, the flamethrowers go off and reduce them to skeletons again. So they are trapped in a continuous cycle of being burnt to death, barely coming back to life, and then immediately being burnt to death again, forever.
Starting off at number 10 is Glenn. Kicking off this list today with one that hits close to home for most people. In both the TV show and the comic books, the former pizza delivery boy turned zombie fighter fighter and scout, Glenn, was the one person in the group that believed there could be a future for them all, and he was easily one of people's most favorite characters, which unfortunately in this world means that he probably won't be around for too long. The worst part is that you have so much faith in this character and his future in the story. Maggie was pregnant with his child, and they were going to start a family as they wanted to rebuild society. Fortunately, the group leader Rick Grimes and his friends crossed a guy by the name of Negan, who led a group called, ironically, the Saviors. The group unwittingly incurred his wrath by taking out a lot of the Saviors that attacked the group. Since Rick had taken the lives of Negan's men, Negan came back in full force to get his revenge. But lining up the group of survivors, Negan made his choice at random. It was one of the most tense moments in the comic, and when he finally chose Glenn, bashing his head in with Lucille in front of his wife and friends, he not only proved that anyone in this world could die, but he proved that a comic book can make me cry and want to throw up all at the same time. Number 9, Nemesis. Now look, I'm not gonna say that Nemesis is a great comic book. It's disliked by a lot of people because it basically just relies on its shock and brutality factor, but gives a main character that isn't really likable at all and has a pretty lame plot. But it does rely on the brutality, which means yes, there are some horrible ways to pass into the afterlife presented here. Now disclaimer, the original was not published by Image Comics, so I won't be talking about that one. Instead, we will focus on Nemesis Reloaded, which was published by Image Comics. Anyways, in issue 3 of the Image comic, Nemesis tricks his way onto a police boat with a very specific officer on board. This officer was responsible for the arrest of Nemesis' parents. While they probably did deserve to be arrested because they were criminals, they also lost their lives, and for that, Nemesis wants revenge. So, after knocking out the officer, he comes back to find the boat is now sinking. Nemesis explains who he is and why this is happening, and then he waits as the boat sinks, and then is picked up by his henchmen. All the while, the officer sinks to his watery grave. No thank you. I'm good. I don't like that. Number 8, Headbutt. The oldest Viltrumites are usually the most powerful of the bunch. One old-timer Viltrumite goes by the name of Conquest, and he is one grizzled old man, battle-scarred with a cybernetic arm and breath that smells like feet. He arrives on Earth to check on Mark's progress with taking over the planet after the Invincible War, so it's safe to say Mark is not in the best mood. But Conquest does not care, and these two have an absolute slog of a battle over the course of 4 issues of the comic. Conquest takes a few hits, but Mark is no match for this guy in the slightest. In an attempt to help Invincible, his girl, Adam Eve, decides to show up on the battlefield and lend a hand. She was far out of her league, and Conquest punched a hole right through her. Actually, he didn't punch, he went like that. I don't know what to call that. That was a line for Mark though, and it sends him into a frenzy. The two Superman-like beings fly straight at one another, and Mark punches straight through Conquest's cybernetic arm, breaking his own arm in the process. He uses his unbroken hand to clock the old man across the face. He bites a massive chunk out of the guy's shoulder. Adam Eve, out of nowhere, revives herself and lends a helpful blast, and then when Conquest breaks Mark's other hand, Invincible uses his head and headbutts Conquest over and over and over and over and over again until what was once an old grizzled Viltrumite's face is now just ground beef. Number 7, Completely Obliterated. If you haven't heard of Image Comics' new series Vanish, allow me to introduce you. Vanish? Nerds. Now you've met. Vanish follows Oliver Harrison. This chosen one peaked at the age of 14 when he took down the leader of the biggest threat to his universe in a mystical place called the Everkeep. Now, as an adult, this chosen one indulges in every vice he can, living a mediocre, sloppy life. Until a group of heroes show up called the Prestige, who are actually the followers of the threat that Oliver took down as a child. The leader of this group of heroes is called Halcyon, and just like the rest, he isn't what he actually seems. Trying to get to Oliver, Halcyon goes after Oliver's ex-best friend, another magic user by the name of Deacon Dust. But Deacon is loyal and refuses to give in to Halcyon no matter how much pain the hero inflicts on him. After launching a bloody ball of spit in Halcyon's face, Deacon is subsequently obliterated in an explosion of guts, innards, and 2 eyeballs. This is only issue 4, so I for one hope we get to see Deacon again, but after that, I don't think there's much chance. Number 6. Bit by a walker. In the world of Robert Kirkman's The Walking Dead, other people are the most dangerous foe one can encounter. People with selfish motivations and with no kind of law and order to keep them in check will do the absolute worst things, but the whole reason that is the case in this story is because the rest of the world have been turned into a horde of undead. So many characters fall to the undead in these comics, and not a single one of those untimely demises looks like they'd be particularly great. For starters, you're having chunks ripped out of you by a walking corpse. That is terrifying. But in most cases, the walkers don't travel solo, which means that more often than not, you're being completely swarmed and torn apart by an entire herd of the Walking Dead. So that's all bad enough, but what if you get bit but manage to escape? Well, now you have to slowly and agonizingly succumb to the zombie infection, turning you into one of the undead and potentially forcing you to turn on your own friends. That's assuming you or one of your closest friends isn't around to put you out of your misery. There is a reason The Walking Dead caused the collapse of society in this Image Comics series. It's because they're scary. Number 5. Thrag vs. Battle Beast. The incredibly powerful and barbarian-like alien known as Thok, aka Battle Beast, fights for the good guys or the bad guys, as long as it serves his goal to find his equal and better in combat so that they can bring the end of his life in an honorable battle. Honor is the key part here. During his fight against Thrag, the unfathomably strong leader of the Viltrumites, Thok recognizes Thrag's strength and the two go at it. Now, the Coalition of Worlds organized the use of Ragnars, which are one of the only species of aliens who have proven strong enough to take down Viltrumites. Battle Beast was told that they would only be released if he failed to take down Thrag, so when they were released at the start of the battle and gave Thrag a massive wound, Battle Beast was actually incredibly peed, and he decided to stop fighting Thrag and instead help him defeat the Ragnars so that they could have a fair fight, which Thrag even remarks was a stupid thing to do. But not only did he take away his own advantage, but he even injured himself across the abdomen in the same way that Thrag had been injured, just so he wouldn't have any unfair advantages. These two absolute monsters fought for days until Thrag got the upper hand and crushed the heart of Thok after the honorable warrior thanked Thrag for the fight of his life. Literally. Number 4. Duel on the Sun. But since I hate Thrag for taking the life of Battle Beast and for being a Freddie Mercury clone, let's talk about how his life came to a close. In the climactic battle between Mark Grayson, Invincible, and Thrag, who had been one of the primary antagonists through the series, Invincible had taken their fight to the very surface of the sun itself. These guys are so powerful that their fight actually goes on for some time, but once Mark forces the two of them into the sun, things really start to heat up. Pun intended. These two keep up their fight even as they're both burning and melting, breaking bones and taking chunks out of each other. The problem for Thrag is that Mark has allies. Thrag has no one. His only motivation is strength, and in the end, that strength failed him when Mark got help from one of Robot's suits that gave him just a few extra minutes of survival on the sun's surface. The slogfest finally came to an end when Mark took a bite out of Thrag's neck, leaving him to burn to nothingness on the sun while Mark was saved by Alan the alien. Number 3. Head Smushed. Saga is an awesome comic book out of Image Comics, and I just started reading it last week, and it's quickly becoming a favorite. In the comic, there are bounty hunters, mercenary types called freelancers. One of these freelancers goes by the name The Will, and he is hired to bring down the main characters for supposed crimes that they committed, the crime of being in love and making a baby together. But that's not important. The Will takes a trip to a lovely little place called Sextillion. If you didn't infer from the name of this place, it's essentially a whole colony in space that seems to have one purpose: pleasure. Speaking of that though, the Will gets picked up by a groomer. Basically a guy who is in charge of a handful of women thinks the Will be interested in. For some very obvious reasons, the Will is not interested in this girl and is actually incredibly angry that this girl is even being used like this. So the Will introduces this groomer's head to the insides of his hands and completely destroys it. Gone in a flash. Good riddance, bye. Number 2. Crucified. I bet you were worried Spawn wasn't gonna make this list, didn't you? I wouldn't do that to you guys. Come on. In Spawn number 27, we learn of Philip Cran, who has spent his life studying the occult so that one day he could gain access to heaven. Pretty sure that's not how it works, but hey. Calling himself the Curse, very cool, Philip decided the best thing to do in his heavenly endeavor would be to bring down the Hellspawn Al Simmons. Spawn was an agent of heaven at that point though, and was imbued with mystical energy, which Philip would then siphon off for himself. Because he is clearly no match for Spawn, Philip goes with a complete sneak attack on Simmons, blowing a hole clear through Spawn's chest. Unsurprisingly, Spawn wasn't especially pleased about being ambushed and made holy by this psycho. See what I did there? That was good. So he tracks down the Curse and blasts off his bionic arm. The two engage in a battle that began and ended pretty quickly though. Since Spawn was at full power and the Curse was just a crazy guy in a costume, he didn't last that long at all. Spawn beat the absolute beans out of the Curse and then strung up his almost lifeless body against a wall in an alley to warn off any further enemies. That would have resulted in Philip's passing, but his fate was actually even worse later on. But we're not going to talk about it. Number 1, Paul. Now that was pretty bad, but let's fast forward all the way to Spawn issue number 322. Essentially, there was this vampire named Paul, and he had taken a girl and had been keeping her in his house for years, where he would not only drain her, but do anything he wanted. Now look, Spawn is from hell, but there are some lines you just don't cross. Spawn's anger and rage at this guy seems to make him even more powerful, to the point that none of Paul's attempts to stop the Hellspawn even faze him a little bit, and he quickly incapacitates the vampire using a horrifying amount of bugs, but not before he tells Paul to say Monday. When Paul comes back to, he is chained up and Spawn makes him say Friday. Kinda weird, but that's because it has been 5 days since the vampire last fed. On top of that, Spawn had made some roaches go inside Paul and eat away at anything his body produced to help with his hunger, so this guy is starving. Spawn lets a mouse go free down a skinny little hallway and informs Paul that there is even more blood for him at the end of the hallway, and he can either go down that or stay where he is and be consumed by the roaches. Naturally, Paul chooses the hallway, but you see, Spawn had removed all the spikes from his costume and instead put them on either side of said hallway, so Paul has to basically be torn to pieces as he makes his way through, with the bugs chasing after every drop of Paul's blood that hits the ground. But he doesn't, and when he finally gets through, Spawn is there with Paul's mistreated dogs, who have also not eaten in 5 days. Spawn gives Paul the key to the exit, which is back on the other end of the hallway, so Paul is forced to go back through, pursued by ravenous dogs on one side and blood and flesh consuming insects on the other. Needless to say, Paul doesn't make it through.
Number 10, Dark Beast. I think the worst thing about being killed by Dark Beast would be the fact that he would likely do everything in his power to actually not kill you. Which sounds counterintuitive to this list, but just go with me. He would just keep you alive while he subjects you to terrible biological experiments, which sounds pretty awful. Dark Beast is the alternate version of Hank McCoy of the X-Men who hails from Earth 295. Here, he is not a member of the X-Men, but one of Apocalypse's lead geneticists and allies. Earth 295 is basically an alternate reality where Apocalypse successfully conquered the Earth, spinning out of the Age of Apocalypse event and follow-up line. I would at least say that Age of Apocalypse kind of became a comic line afterwards, because although the timeline kind of got fixed, it continued to go on. Dark Beast tends to focus more on experimenting on folks to improve them or simply to learn more about them. Also, improve them. According to Dark Beast, their improvements. However, he isn't as morally sound as Earth 616 Hank is, which is why you wouldn't want to become his victim. Although right now, Beast of Earth 616, the main continuity, feels like he's kind of becoming more and more like his darker AOA counterpart. Honestly, being killed by Dark Beast would be terrible because it would likely be long, and drawn out, and in the end the dying would actually probably feel like a relief in comparison to everything else that you went through leading up to it. And friends, before I move on to my next spot on this list, if you love when we talk about some of the worst things to have happened in comics, you should check out our Worst Things That Happened playlist. We have one of those. Go check it out. Click the thing somewhere over here. Number 9, Statuified. While in her current series, the Scarlet Witch, Wanda Maximoff, has not been killing anyone, she has been coming in hot with pretty epic punishments for the malicious villains who have crossed her path. In issue number 1, she actually ends up dealing with Corruptor, who she does not kill but does severely punish by turning him into stone. And even if he does get to live as a statue in the town, that's not really living Is it? In fact, initially, the town the Corruptor had tormented wanted to completely destroy him by smashing him in his statue form to little pieces. However, Wanda is the voice of reason here who cautions them against acting on vengeful impulses. Wanda kind of being like, look, I've lived that life, I wouldn't recommend. Still, we don't know what happened here, so, I mean, he could be dead, because Wanda's like, look, it's up to you, I wouldn't do it, bye. So they could have done it afterwards. And if he was killed this way, what a way to go. Though I imagine it's more likely that we'll see him return later in the series after having somehow escaped his stone prison to seek revenge on Wanda for trapping him there, because, I mean, that's just how comics usually go. So I'd be surprised if it doesn't happen, but, you know, I could be wrong. Number 8. Impaled. Shout out to Eric Curse in the comments on our part 3 for this one. Sugarman is a character I hadn't thought of for some time, but being killed by him would certainly not be fun. He is another mad geneticist type, my favorite kind of villain. Definitely not a villain I'd ever want to run into, mad geneticist types. Except for, I would say, Mr. Sinister. I think I could actually maybe befriend Mr. Sinister at least. But as I said, in general, these are usually the worst when it comes to meeting your end. And like some others on our list, Sugarman is pretty fond of impaling. Sugarman does this in issue number 4 of Generation Next with his tongue, actually killing one of his own guards, Quietus, when he suspects that someone is attempting to basically infiltrate his power station. Sugarman hails from the reality known as Age of Apocalypse, aka Earth 295, but he eventually makes his way to the main reality of Earth 616. Number 7. Whispers. Black Bolt is someone you probably never want to get too close to if you were in the Marvel Universe, unless you were someone who was completely certain they were safe from ever-angering Blackagar, I guess. And then again, you'd still probably want to be a little cautious considering that Black Bolt could sneeze and accidentally kill you, especially if you were a squishy human as both you and I are right now. Or are we? Well, I'm assuming you're a human. If you're an alien or a mutant, leave an alien, or there's no mutant emojis, leave an X emoji in the comments so we can get a clear sense for how many off-world nerds and how many mutant nerds we have watching this video right now. Black Bolt has merely gone up to someone, whispered into their ear, and obliterated them in the past, and I gotta be honest, it doesn't sound like the most pleasant way to go. It doesn't sound like the most pleasant way to go. Haha. I didn't even realize I did that, but there it is. Pun accidental, but intended for sure. Number 6. Kissed goodbye and tossed into the sun. That was how The Void went in issue number 8 of the second volume of Sentry. The Void is basically the dark reflection of Robert Reynolds' Sentry. Sentry is a superhero from Marvel whose powers make him comparable to Superman in terms of the sheer strength he possesses. He is said to have the power of 1 million burning suns, but apparently it only took one sun to defeat the Void, at least this time around. The Void of course would return because he's kind of like always gonna come back in some way. Still, I think getting thrown into the sun after being kissed goodbye by your good alter ego is a pretty wild way to go. Also, would that not be terrible for you as the Sentry? We don't see it on panel, but like I kind of have to imagine it would feel a little bit like burning half of yourself away, as the Void is meant to represent the darker side and temptation of Bob's power. Sentry is both Sentry and the Void, so yeah. Also, what would that fight look like if you were just like watching it in space? Does it just look like the Sentry like fighting himself? Probably not. It's probably like an actual shadow entity, but it would be kind of funny if it was him fighting himself. Number 5. Shallow water. Oh boy, this is not just a terrible way to go in terms of physically what is happening here, but also in terms of the emotional stakes that are involved in this one. We're talking about the death of Daken. I know in part 3 of this series we talked about how awful it would be to be killed by Daken, but at the same time, this story kinda makes me feel for him. Daken is the son of Wolverine, who was basically manipulated into hating and resenting his dad since he was a kid. At one point, the two are pitted against one another by Sabretooth, and Wolverine is forced to take him out, using one of a few weaknesses that both he and his son share: water. Ugh. Wolverine drowns Daken in a puddle as we get a vision, a dream, if you will, of what life could have been like were Daken actually raised by his biological parents, Logan and Itsu. This death wouldn't stick, and now we know Daken as the anti-hero Akahiro, his given name, but that doesn't make it any less tragic or awful. This was still a pretty terrible thing that happened. Number 4. Heartless. So admittedly, the way Magneto went was pretty epic, but at the same time sounds like it would be immensely painful and stressful were you to be in his shoes. Magneto ended up being perma-killed, or at least perma-killed for now, I guess we could say, might be forever, but probably just for now, on Mars, aka Planet Arakko, while helping to defend the planet and its Iraqi mutant population against Uranos. Or at least that was the beginning of his end, I should say. Uranos ripped out Magneto's heart and left him for dead, but through sheer will, Eric used his Master of Magnetism powers to keep his blood pumping through his body, and ended up continuing on. He even got in a rematch with Uranos with a shockingly fantastic assist from Storm. Oh, such a good moment. In the end, Uranos was defeated, but Magneto was left dead. I can't even imagine fighting Uranos on a good day, never mind doing it while heartless and maintaining my own life support. Also, if you missed when this happened, you want to go check out AXE Judgment Day, or Axe Judgment Day, which is also a pretty fun event, I will say. I enjoyed it. Number 3, becoming Ultron. If you've been watching Top 10 Nerd and the content I make over here for a while, then you'll likely know that one of my biggest fears is possession. So needless to say, this is one that gets me. For this demise, we're talking about the complete eradication of Hank Pym, which is awful, especially in the sense that when it happened, we didn't even really understand that Pym had actually died. Hank Pym at one point ends up being merged with his evil creation, Ultron. Ultron forces the two of them to merge together, and something new is made, this hybrid being identified as Ultron Pym, and for a while we actually believed that this entity was both Hank and Ultron together. However, we later learn in the Tony Stark Iron Man series that Hank had actually died when this happened, and that the version of him that seemed to exist still within Ultron Pym was actually nothing more than a simulation. In other words, Ultron Pym is just Ultron walking around in like a Hank Pym skin suit. Which is horrifying to think about. Number 2, Cassandra Nova. Cassandra Nova is definitely someone you don't want to mess with if you're in the Marvel Universe. In fact, you probably just don't even want to meet her. You probably just want to stay far away from her. She's basically the evil twin of Professor X, who is known for being just as powerful as he is, if not more powerful sometimes, and definitely a lot more evil. She has taken people out in a variety of horrible different ways, but I think one of the worst was definitely Donald Trask's ending. I don't even know how to describe what happens to Donald Trask in issue number 115 of the new X-Men. Nova basically copies his DNA and then like phases her hands through him. Although I imagine this is happening psychically, or that it's meant to be what's implied here. But with Nova, I mean, you never really know. This could be psychically, or it could be physically, or it could be both. This could be some kind of telekinetic trick of hers where she literally does manage to put her hands physically through your head to kill you. I mean, Nova's a telepath, not really like a telekinetic, but I would believe if she was like, also I'm that too. I would believe that she just psionically is on a whole other level. Either way, ouch. What's worse is she was of course copying Trask's DNA so that she could gain the ability to control and command the Sentinel army. Ugh. Number 1, Dire Wraith. Big thanks to Canon Ranger for this suggestion. Goodness, are Dire Wraiths frightening. Touche. These creatures basically assimilate you, allowing them to adapt to your shape and even absorb your knowledge and memories that you've gained throughout your time living. They do this by piercing your skull with their barbed tongue and basically sucking all that knowledge and brain juice out of your noggin. In the process, you shrivel and pretty quickly die. Yikes. I don't know about you, but this is not a way that I would like to go. I feel like the idea of anyone sticking their tongue into my skull just, yeah, that sounds nasty in like the worst way possible. This also really plays on my fear of possession, because after killing you, the Dire Wraith can then kind of like adopt your form and then use it to get close to your loved ones and, you know, possibly also kill them, which would terrify me in my last moments of life to think about that.
Coming in at number 10, it's the Medic. This one came out of nowhere, for me at least. In the opening moments of issue 12 of Saga, we are on a battlefield between the Wings and the Horns, with Prince Robot IV, who was just taken a hit, and a medic is called over. A medic who basically looks like an anthropomorphic mouse. That doesn't really matter. Basically, the medic saves Prince Robot and tells him about how he supports the Wings since they saved his home planet, and how he's serving as a medic to get his degree. Nice. When all of a sudden some gas-like spell is used by the enemy, which seems to be against the rules of engagement. While everyone else puts on their gas masks, it turns out the medic wasn't ever given one. This medic looks around in a panic, realizing and asking if he is going to pass away, and within moments he puffs up and gets all deformed, and then he just straight up pops in an explosion of gore. Sad.
Number 9, mermaids. To some, this might actually sound like a pleasant way to go, because I mean, mermaids. But to those who know mermaids from the pages of Black Cloak, not so much. The mermaids in this world are known for being deadly and dangerous beasts, although some do more think of them as misunderstood, which honestly there's kind of some points to that, but I digress. Mermaids here tend to, eat their victims. I don't know about you, but for me the thought of being devoured alive or even attacked underwater is horrifying. Add in the fact that when mermaids get angry or hungry they look like this, and yeah, I would not want to meet my end this way. Although I will say at least you seem to get to experience a sense of euphoria before you die, as their song, or rather their speech, tends to hypnotize you and make you kind of hallucinate that everything is light and beautiful and great. Although in a way, that actually might make your death even more horrific here when you think about it.
Coming in at number 8, it's a blood transfusion. Phil Dirt was one of Savage Dragon's first friends when he joined the Chicago Police Department, and he also developed a crush on the hero. His homosexuality was something that made Phil's partner on the force, Howard Neisman, uncomfortable. Howard was pretty bigoted, but despite that, they still would put their personal differences aside and were loyal to one another as police officers and partners. This loyalty was shown when Phil was mauled by the shark man known as Mako, who took a big chunk out of the guy. If that wasn't bad enough, Phil also discovered that he was infected with AIDS, and he asked Howard for help. Howard went to Dragon asking him to give a blood transfusion to Phil to try and save his life. The transfusion cured Phil and even regenerated the wounds that he received, but it also mutated Phil, and Dragon felt something might possibly go wrong, and unfortunately, he was right. The unstable nature of Dragon's blood caused Phil to eventually explode during the ride to the hospital, covering Howard and his truck with anything that may have been inside poor old Phil here.
Number 7, Down with the Ship. I don't know how the captain really ended up expiring in the first issue of The Forged. There's a lot here that we don't quite fully understand yet because, you know, it's the first issue. But that's part of the fun with this story. This world that we enter in this action-packed, bug-stomping, gritty, futuristic space adventure is vast, as is highlighted by the pages of text at the end, expanding upon some of the lore that's hinted at in the issue, touching on the politics, as well as literally mapping out the empire that we are thrown into here. What I do know is that however the captain went, I wouldn't want to go that way. In this first issue of The Forged, we are introduced to an elite team of fighters who are part of a crew type known for getting the impossible done. This kind of crew is known as the Forged. They are sent on a suspiciously simple mission to retrieve a black box from an abandoned wreck on a distant and deadly world. However, before they're deployed, a space witch known as a Cassandra in this series aboard the massive ship seems to be interested in tweaking some of the mission's parameters and conditions. As soon as they deploy, she heads to the bridge to, I don't know, transform and kill everyone? That seems like what's happening here. I'm not really sure what's happening here, but it does not look good as the entire massive ship crashes down towards the planet that our Forged are deployed to. Also, I think there's like 90,000 people on that ship, so that's pretty crazy. Is this woman a Cassandra? Is she something else? What's happening here? I don't know, but it's awful.
Coming in at number 6, it's Billy Kincaid. Billy Kincaid, first introduced in issue 5 of the Spawn comic book series, is an incredibly deranged and disgusting killer. Originally sentenced to 22 years in prison for taking the life of someone way too young, his good behavior coupled with his attorney and a ridiculous positive psychiatric evaluation saw Kincaid gain early parole after only 6 years. Now, before his passing and return as Spawn, Al Simmons had been hired as an assassin to take out Kincaid. However, he arrived just as the cops had caught this man. Al learned that Kincaid's real victim count is all the way up at 27, but with no solid evidence and someone covering Kincaid's tracks, he was never caught for those crimes. Now, 6 years later and out of prison, Billy Kincaid went right back to his old habits. Picking up his occupation as Mr. Chill E, the ice cream man, he ends up taking the life of another innocent soul. Spawn, finding out Kincaid has been freed, is able to track Kincaid down, and the next time we see Billy, he is chained up in Detective Sam Burke's office, impaled with popsicle sticks and an ice cream scoop with a popsicle shoved in his no longer moving mouth. A note Spawn apparently attached to this body reads, "Boys scream and girls screamed, so I made him scream and scream and scream," and that is horrifying, but good riddance.
Number 5, Cut Short. I don't know how else to describe for the title here for this point that it would be allowed on this platform. So we're just going to take inspiration straight from the issue, where the creep narrates asking, "Scared of what, Nate? Your sentence was cut short. Just like your life." I don't know if that's what the creep, this creep probably does not sound like that. This demise comes to us from issue number 1 of Creepshow, and the first story within it, Take 1. This is like the first few pages, friends, of this issue. Nate is one of the hooligans we meet who, with his friends or his, I don't know, honestly they seem like a group of little criminals, ventures to take more than one candy from a bowl placed out on Halloween, seemingly by a dead man, Mr. Xander. Well, it turns out that for a corpse, Mr. Xander is actually pretty lively, and he doesn't take too well to people taking more than their fair share of candy. He rushes Nate and his friend from behind, pushing Nate's face into the sewer grate and stomps on him.
Number 4, the Governor. The Governor is not someone that you find yourself caring for. Honestly, he is really the first major human antagonist that the group faces in The Walking Dead. Leading his own group or community called Woodbury, at first the Governor seems like a decent dude, for about 5 minutes before he threatens to feed Rick, Glenn, and Michonne to walkers and then cuts off Rick's hand. He ends up keeping the 3 captive and treating Michonne the worst of the bunch. When she finally escapes, she comes back for some pretty serious revenge. After knocking Mr. Governor unconscious, Michonne strips him down to his skivvies, drills through his shoulder blades, does unspeakable things to his downstairs situation, shoves a spoon where the sun don't shine, completely takes out his left eye, nearly severs an artery, pulls off his fingernails, and completely cuts off his right arm. Nice. Somehow though, the Governor actually survives this, leading to an incredibly savage attack on the prison where the group of survivors are staying. Now during this attack, being completely bloodthirsty, he forces members of his community to attack, which results in the horrible passing of Lori and Judith, at which point the Governor's own people turn on him, blasting through the back of his head and kicking him into a horde of zombies like that. Just like that.
Number 3, Devil's Due. One of the most haunting moments from the Dark Ride series still comes from its very first issue for me. This comic has stuck with me mentally from the beginning, and this moment is a big part of the reason I think why that happened. In the very first issue, we meet our seeming protagonist for the series, Owen Seasons. However, before the issue is even fully over, Owen's fate is sealed and he is seemingly killed. Initially, I simply thought he was going to have some kind of horrific and mysterious experience, go missing for a while, but he would return, maybe changed, but no, he literally just ends up being forced onto a ride known as Devil's Due and is roasted to a crisp while being torn limb from limb by what I can only describe as demon claws and teeth. Following this, it's later suggested that Owen is haunting the park and that his corpse is used as adornment for the ride. The latter is actually revealed when his sister, an investigative journalist, infiltrates the park in search of him and finds his corpse while exploring after hours.
Coming in at number 2, it's the Guardians of the Globe. One of the best moments in Invincible, or the worst I guess, both in the comic and the show, happens really early on. After becoming comfortable with the good guys in the story, mainly Mark Grayson and his family, including his dad Omni-Man, the strongest superhero on Earth, we pick up in issue 7, or in the final moments of episode 1 of the show, being introduced to each member of Earth's premier superhero team, the Guardians of the Globe. War Woman, Darkwing, Red Rush, Aquarius, Martian Man, Green Ghost, and the Immortal were all given backstories and character development, getting you into this powerful group of heroes, and in a fraction of that time, you watch them get absolutely decimated by Omni-Man himself. In the comics, this is carried out over 2 pages. We see eyes popped out, necks turned completely around, heads removed from shoulders, and torsos turned into Swiss cheese. But in the show, this plays out in under 3 minutes. Red Rush gets his head crushed. That's a good rhyme. Darkwing is splattered on the floor, Green Ghost loses their face and is used as a shield, Aquarius gets obliterated, War Woman gets her head spun around, Martian Man has his heart removed, and the Immortal becomes a head shorter.
Number 1, Munch Munch Munch. This fearsome fate caused some of the most recoiling I've done in some time during a read-through of a comic. We are talking about when YouTuber Theo got in a little too deep when it came to his investigation into the going-ons and recent tragedy at Devilland. In issue number 4 of Dark Ride, Theo is drawn in by a mysterious text message promising to reveal the secrets of Devil's Land and the Dante family who created it. He heads over for what he hopes will be an insightful meeting, but instead gets his head literally munched by one of the suits.
Alright, kicking off the list at number 10 is Robin. Why not kick off this list at the beginning? The inciting incident for our protagonist. In both the show and the comic book, we pick up with Hughie Campbell, who isn't exactly the pillar of his community, when he is out and about with his girlfriend, Robin. In the show, Hughie and Robin are walking along the street when Robin accidentally winds up on the street and gives Hughie a kiss. In the comic, Hughie and Robin are at a fair when they share their kiss and are all lovey and giddy and all that good romantic stuff. But in both instances, the happy moment is brought to an incredibly abrupt end when Robin is completely obliterated thanks to the superhero known as A-Train. For the show, A-Train himself runs straight through Robin, causing both him and Hughie to be completely covered in Robin soup. In the comic, A-Train and a supervillain were doing some super speed battle when the villain was rammed straight into Robin and then a brick wall, moving at about Mach 3. In both instances, Hughie is left hanging onto Robin's detached forearms. At least it was quick.
Number 9. Disfigured and discarded. I think one of the worst ways to go in the comics is actually Vicor's implied death. Although we don't see it on panel, the soup known as Mighty Warrior is used by Butcher to gain information on the Scorchers. How does Butcher convince Vicor to join him? By visiting him at his wife Norska's funeral and throwing him into the cremation oven next to her remains. While left horribly disfigured by this incident right afterwards, Vicor surprisingly survives thanks to his superhuman durability and even manages to heal most of his face. In the end, once Butcher has no more use of him, it's implied that he basically takes Mighty Warrior out to the forest in the guise of a secret meeting to dispose of him. Brutal. I just can't believe that Butcher did this at, you know, Mighty Warrior's wife's funeral. Like, I know Vicor wasn't too broken up about it because of what happens in that comic, or at least, you know, he seemed to move on pretty quickly, but still. Then again, this is Butcher, so I guess I shouldn't be too surprised.
Number 8. Head Pop. In The Boys TV show, there is a character named Victoria Nadia Newman, who becomes a pretty major antagonist, whereas the character she is based on, Victor Newman, in the comics, is just the guy who becomes vice president. The thing about Victoria, unlike Victor, is she is actually, spoiler alert, a soup, with the inflexible ability to make people's heads completely pop in a small explosion of disgustingness. Using this ability, she has been able to take out Susan Rayner, Jonah Vogelbaum, Alastair Adana, and several other members of Congress. Now, just like Robin, you know, at least this is quick, but it's not exactly a demise I would wish on anyone. I can't imagine the pain of having your head explode would be light, and because it's so quick, the rest of your body would have to like catch up to what just happened, and the idea of that is not sitting well with me in my tummy.
Number 7. Sneeze. Many of these for me are going to be from The Boys live action series because they're just so brutal and so visual, and I just love the live action series so much. Once you see a lot of these, it's hard to get them out of your head. Case in point, in season 3 of the show, when Peter, Termite's love interest, is killed. Termite shrinks down to do something that I probably can't talk about here on YouTube. Let's just say it's something Peter very much enjoys. However, during this intimate moment between them, while Termite is shrunk down and literally inside of Peter's body, Termite sneezes. This causes Termite to unintentionally lose control of his powers momentarily, which can happen when he sneezes, changing back to his normal size. Well, I think you can see where I'm going with this one. If you have also watched season 3, which I hope you have if you're watching this video, then I'm sure this was also a moment that forever stuck out in your mind.
Number 6. Pop Claw. This part is kind of twofold. A-Train in the show seems like one of the only redeemable members of the Seven, outside of Starlight obviously. Well, A-Train was once on a team called Teenage Kicks, with Pop Claw, a Wolverine-inspired soup, and his secret girlfriend. Pop Claw was involved in one of the show's most heinous deaths when she accidentally crushes her landlord with her legs while they were doing the deed, if you know what I mean. That one was pretty shocking to watch, but Popclaw herself also suffered a pretty upsetting passing. Popclaw has a pretty damaged reputation. A-Train was so insecure about this, especially in the eyes of Homelander, that when he saw her as a liability, he took her life by giving her a substance overdose. It was pretty horrible to watch and makes me wonder how the hell they are planning to redeem A-Train going forward. Also, it's very real.
Number 5. Biting your own tongue. Sounds like a weird way to put it, but that is in essence what happened to Stormfront in the end. Or at least what we were told happened to her I'm pretty sure it's what happened, but you know. She took her own life by biting off her tongue. While I'm still a little skeptical of this, as you know, we don't see her body or the act in question, I do believe that Stormfront at this point was extremely depressed, and so it does make sense that she would, you know, take this out. And also, we do at least, you know, see where she was when it happened. She ends up dying on Homelander's birthday, which causes him to have a straight up diabolical reaction to a woman threatening to jump off the building, who throughout the course of their conversation basically changes her mind. He's supposed to save her because it's his birthday save. I personally think, although Stormfront seemed to deserve her death and that it definitely felt karmic to me, that this would still be a pretty terrible way to go.
Number 4. Timothy. The Deep in the show is pretty much the most pathetic hero of the 7. He might not be as pure evil and maniacal as Homelander, but he's still done some incredibly horrible things that are not redeemable at all. The only thing close to being redeemable is his care for aquatic animal life, which is still uncomfortable because he has some really deep relationships with some of his aquatic life, pun intended. Anyways, like his relationship with Timothy the octopus. This relationship is brought to an incredibly bad end. Basically, Homelander forces the Deep to eat Timothy alive during a dinner with Ashley and his once upon a time wife, Cassandra. I believe it was Homelander trying to make Deep conform with the rest of humanity, which isn't really an excuse because Timothy was an innocent character, and as we know, octopi are incredibly smart. So to see Timothy killed off to show Homelander's cruelty and the Deep's cowardice was pretty horrific. The Deep slurping down his friend alive was made even worse when he said that Timothy was crying. It was all CGI, sure, and people love to eat octopus, but this is just awful.
Number 3. Made to Jump. Speaking of terrible deaths, while Stormfront's demise definitely sounds pretty bad, I think the woman who was there with Homelander when he heard about it, Chelsea, had it a lot worse. She was the one who was threatening to jump off a building when Homelander flew to her rescue. At first, his tactic was basically to convince her there was really no point of jumping because if Chelsea jumped, he'd just fly down and catch her before her body hit the pavement. Basically, it was all futile, he said, so she might as well just like give it up. However, after learning of Stormfront's death, which by the way happens on Homelander's birthday, Homelander refuses to accept that Chelsea's life matters more than that of the woman he loved. And even when Chelsea begs to be let go and actually changes her mind, recanting on her initial conviction to jump, Homelander basically pushes her off the roof.
Alright, and at number 2, Homelander. Okay, so spoilers for The Boys comic book series, which finished in 2012. What was arguably the biggest twist of the comic came near the end of the story, in issue number 65 specifically. Luckily, this twist is not present in the show, so you don't need to worry about this, but it turns out that Black Noir is secretly a Homelander clone. He was created with the whole purpose of being meant to take Homelander down if he ever loses control. Problem is, Homelander enjoys being a puppet of Vought International, and that puts Homelander well in their good graces, so Homelander never ends up going rogue. This makes Black Noir incredibly frustrated, as he has been looking for the day when he'll finally fulfill his purpose of bringing down Homelander, only to never be given it for years and years and years. In the final issues of The Boys, after slowly watching Homelander get more and more insane, he finally snaps and attacks the White House, taking out the president. This finally opened up Black Noir to finally do what he was made to finally do, when he showed up to the White House in the climactic issue 65, revealing himself as a clone and then going for an absolute slogfest against the completely shocked Homelander. They ripped each other to shreds, but Black Noir came out on top before he stepped out onto the front lawn, missing significant chunks of his body. That is when the US military, alongside Billy Butcher, brought this insane soup to his brutal end with one final blow from Billy Butcher's crowbar and brain-crushing fist.
Number 1. Pulverized. I don't really know how else to describe what happened to Supersonic. He was the ex of Starlight, who was originally known by the name Drummer Boy, a member of the all-superhero band Super Sweet. He and Starlight once dated and were friends, as we saw during his time on American Hero. American Hero was basically a reality TV show that Vought used to recruit their newest member of the 7 after Stormfront was, of course, removed from the team. Alex, under the codename Supersonic, ended up winning and joined Starlight in a plot to basically try and take down Homelander. However, he made a mistake in trying to recruit A-Train to their side, who basically ratted out Alex and Annie to Homelander. As punishment, Homelander ended up killing Alex brutally, to the point that when he revealed Alex's corpse to Starlight, Alex was pretty much almost unrecognizable, save for his suit. His limbs and body were basically torn asunder, and his face was just pretty much gone.